of how Putin got this decision on Ukraine so badly wrong. Because here we are on day 25 of the war. They still haven't taken Kharkiv, only 20 miles from the Russian frontier. They've taken Kherson, only one medium-sized city. They're fighting in, I think it's Mariupol. So everybody thought that Kiev was going to fall a long time ago, so did I, and the Russian military hasn't even managed to envelop the Ukrainian capital city. So Russia's facing a lose-lose situation. If they don't manage to conquer Ukraine, they've lost. If they do manage to conquer Ukraine, then they're mired in a decades-long insurgency, counterinsurgency campaign, potentially, against a very determined, very united, and very hostile population, which will be armed to the teeth by NATO. So how do they pull back without facing utter humiliation? No wonder Russia says, well, we're open to some sort of compromise now, which shows that perhaps Putin is not as irrational as we feared. Because previously they were saying, this is it, ultimatum, take it or leave it. It's simply their wish list. You have to agree to all of these or forget it, or the fighting continues. But now they're going soft on one of these. Trouble is, they did sign that agreement. We know that Putin would renege on it because he always breaks his promises. Anyway, so what really went wrong in the run-up to this was groupthink. And you see this in societies which strongly emphasize conformity, as Russia under Putin certainly does. Back to the 90s, it was certainly the case of let 1,000 schools of thought contend. There was a huge cheating in elections. In the 90s, they had completely free speech. So he's always promoting social unity, calling social disharmony is a crime there. And that's led to various irrational decisions. That the state is very dysfunctional and sclerotic because countervailing points of view cannot even be considered, mustn't be expressed. So this overemphasis on cohesion means that no one's willing to play advocatus diaboli and say, no, that's not going to work, these are the difficulties. But, we could perhaps surmount these difficulties, but no, it's not that he's willing to acknowledge there are even superable obstacles that they're going to face. And to get into his inner circle, you have to agree at all costs. So therefore, minimalizing tension amongst the elite means that people aren't willing to vocalize some of their doubts, some of their reservations. So there's no proper critical and evaluation. They haven't properly analyzed the situation. So deviancy is strongly penalized there. Putin is obviously violently intolerant of dissent. And now this can occur even in Western liberal societies where freedom of expression is cherished, where people are supposed to listen with respect to opposing points of view. Well, we say that obviously groupthink has occurred even in very free countries, but in a society which is tending towards totalitarianism, it's much more likely to happen. So this overemphasis on teamwork, on the collective in Russia, has meant that people aren't willing to red can the leader, which is to tell him all the difficulties they're going to face, point out any flaws in his plan and things like that. And they didn't deliberate on these things properly. So there's this confirmation bias. If you wanted promotion, you had to toe the party line, you had to be a cheerleader for what he wanted. And previously he was circumspect, he waited for his moment, he prepared things, the public mind and everything else, and then he moved swiftly and decisively. He was opportunistic, maybe not making up his mind to the last possible moment, keeping his options open, like the SAS say, never close an option till you absolutely have to, and setting himself limited achievable goals like Crimea, less than 5% of Ukraine's landmass, where Russia was welcomed by most of the population. And instead he's taken on the whole of Ukraine, which was a very different undertaking. So this well could be leading to disaster. They didn't properly evaluate the situation. And when the plan started to go wrong, they've got to reformulate. Well, to some extent they have, as bombarding cities, aerial bombardment as well as artillery bombardment, not going in. So people were unwilling to broach controversial issues in his inner circle. They weren't willing to look for alternative solutions. So he very much discourages creativity. Uniqueness is seen as perversion in his inner circle. So people weren't willing to be independent-minded, even though they were independent-minded, they mustn't express that. And so this has led to a certain dysfunctionality. People are very much in group, and it's led to this illusion of invulnerability. And then they've made them overconfident about the choices that they've made. It's inflated certainty. You see this somewhat in George W. Bush's cabinet about the Iraq War, about weapons of mass destruction, that it couldn't be possibly, probably, it had to be a slam dunk. So exaggerating possibly into probably about evidence of weapons of mass destruction, and in some cases probably into definitely. So everyone is susceptible to peer pressure, but particularly in incipient totalitarian societies. So people go along with the crowd, anything for a quiet life. You mustn't rock the boat, because if you speak out, how will you be perceived by your peers? That you're a dissident, you're a naysayer. We don't want that lone dissenting voice. So in group interactions, people tend to favour going along with the group. Then you're popular. So there's also the Semmelweis reflex. People tend to reject new ideas or evidence which tends to undermine their preconceived notions. So the chain of command mustn't be called into question. You can't be telling your superior, actually, sorry, sir, you're mistaken. Oh, no, I don't think that's going to work. That's not a great idea. And it's led to these bad outcomes for them. So that's why they can't argue for wiser policies. And that he's surrounded himself with yes men. He's in the bubble. And so it's extremely difficult to pass on unwelcome news. That's seen as being unconstructive, offering information that the boss doesn't want to hear. And you saw that in that National Security Council briefing he held in February 2024, where he's giving a tongue lashing to, I think it was Narishkin. Well, do you agree or do you totally agree? Pressurizing him to saying, yeah, yes, he's completely on board with what Putin is doing. So you mustn't confess to have any doubts. And that's presumably that typifies his meeting. So what a toxic work atmosphere. So this is really redounded to their detriment. Hello, Connor. Well, is that Connor Clune or Connor Klein, the guy who used to be in Ukraine a lot and the rather slender chap? I don't know him actually. So decisiveness is sometimes overvalued. So things could have been done so differently, and well, there's certainly group cohesiveness in the Putin cabinet, but that can be faulty, and then it can lead to the bad situational context. Is it'd be better that you be debating what to do, and then one side be right, then you're all going wrong with the wrong idea, going further and further in the wrong direction. It makes it rowing back so much more difficult. So groupthink is expression which is based on George Orwell's idea of one of his other words. I can't remember what it was. Doublethink, yes. So you see how it's led to deterioration in efficiency in Russian governance, and they don't reality test their views. Is that really going to work? We'd like this to be true. Is it actually true? And saying, because some information is unattractive to me, therefore it's untrue. No, no, no. You mustn't refract things through these rose-tinctured spectacles. This is wishful thinking at its worst. So believing things because you want to believe them. So it really is invidious groupthink. That's why they've made so many misjudgments about this. People have been pressured to conform to what the boss wants. So esprit de corps, you find this in the military, means that dissidence is very much disapproved of. So amiability in Putin's inner circle is obviously applauding his decisions and saying, you make so many marvelous decisions, Mr. President, and this is one of your best. Please, I beseech you, go full steam ahead with this one, and no second thoughts, and no turning back, which makes it even a bigger calamity. And that's what led to this irrational action. Now, I'm not saying that Russia's necessarily going to lose. They could still win, but it's rather more challenging than they had apprehended. And it would be extremely stressful to speak out against him if you're in a circle. So that's why there've been a few calamities earlier on. Contradictory views are very much discouraged. Okay, so you can allude a lot about this in social psychology, but there were, as I say, observable situations where he very much demanded that people reinforce his preconceived notions, and people submerge any of their doubts and are unwilling to say this is not the wisest idea. Should we be more cautious? They can't even be ambiguous about it. So his beliefs seem to be unchallengeable. And what does he actually know about the Ukraine conflict? Presumably he doesn't watch Western media. I mean, he hardly speaks any English. And he would say that's all propaganda. He might honestly believe what the Western media is telling him is false. And he's on that feedback loop, constantly having his own views played back to him, think that it's going reasonably well, and perhaps the military commanders can't fess up that it's much more difficult than they realised. I think they obviously did before the war started because they delayed the operation by 8 days. The timing of the attack, 2022. Why February? I think to be just after the Beijing Olympics. The oil prices were getting quite high. He felt the European Union countries couldn't afford to buy less of his oil and gas. That'd be another thing. So he's intimidated his inner candidate. I mean, rule by fear is how it works. He thinks that scaring people means that they respect him. And people don't incur consequences for having told him false information. So he's trying to brainwash everybody, going back to the Gulag era. So that's why they've overestimated their own military prowess and capability. They're unduly optimistic, and therefore they've taken too big a risk. There's this unquestioned belief in the moral rectitude of their mission and in the wisdom of their leader. And therefore they're disregarding some of the repercussions of their actions, certainly negative consequences in terms of the economy, which are far worse than they expected. No, he does speak a tiny bit of English. He's been shown to do it. He doesn't speak German as well as we're led to believe. So anyway, there's closed-mindedness. They've rationalized these warnings, said that their assumptions are erroneous. They stereotyped those who disagree with them, saying that they're limp-wristed, they're wicked, they're prejudiced, they're malevolent, they're feeble, they're caitiffs, they're imbecilic and things like that. And they've demanded uniformity. Presumably there's self-censorship of the more cerebral members of his camarilla, such as Lavrov, and the deviancy is firmly discouraged. And therefore there's this appearance of unanimity, despite, I would suspect, in the minds of some of his courtiers, some grave doubts. And then there's affirmative silence. If you say nothing, then they assume that you concur with what the leader wants, and he demands concurrence. There is heavy pressure to conform, and you're disloyal if you're actually trying to help him. There's no notion of what's the word? Loyal opposition. So certain mind guards are in there. They're trying and prevent dissenting information reaching his ears. Lack of reduction of support from Xi leaves him down to his own resources. Xi won't get involved manually or physically. Yeah, I don't think there's been much economic support from China. They don't like it either. Is oil driven up oil and gas prices? It's playing havoc with the world economy. They're not going to be able to buy grain from Ukraine as they usually do. If Western countries suffer an economic downturn, then they can buy fewer Chinese manufacturers. They don't like Putin tearing up the norms. I know he's a revisionist power, breaking international law so willy-nilly, and being a bull in a china shop. So it's rather bad news from them, and they've given veiled warnings about this. So yeah, group cohesiveness is the problem. We overemphasize this as a virtue. It leads to bad decisions. So avoiding arguments, even dispassionate arguments, is a mistake. Anyway, no, I don't think Crimea is ever going to be returned. Donbass may be 1B. So there's de-individuation. Individuality is firmly discouraged. I don't know about Martin Jacques. So freedom of expression has been very much degraded under him. So there are all sorts of structural faults, and the group has been insulated from information they don't like to hear. So there's a homogeneity to the people in his inner circle, the same generation as him, obviously all Russian, almost all ethnically Russian. The most senior ones from St. Petersburg, most of others from Moscow, former members of the Communist Party. They're often securocrats, and on and on. So it's a totally closed leadership style. So he starts with his opinion, and everybody else is told they've got to agree with him. So therefore they make these very biased decisions, and he demands certainty. And he wasn't always guilty of such unwisdom. So they don't have a proper methodological procedure to look at all the information that tends to confirm this, tends to disconfirm this, writing up a list of pro and contra arguments. No. They just go to do what he wants to do, what he assumes is going to be successful. So it's a very high-stakes decision. There must be a lot of anxiety in his camarilla. and they've minimalized the possibility for this going wrong. They've exaggerated the likelihood of it going right. Anyway, so there's no discussion properly that I can see. I doubt that any disagreement could ever be voiced, and that they won't face up to errors. They're focused on the ultimate goal, and they're not realistic about how they're going to get there. So they don't follow some sort of proper procedure. So your esteem in his circle depends on you feeding his ego. A lot of this is about him. He's demanding quick results, does insist on quality and accuracy of data. So there are time pressures to do this as well, because Putin is dying. And there are no moral dilemmas. He's got no morality or whatever. So that's it really. Anything else I should say? So you can prevent this by reliability, by rewarding people for telling the truth, whether it's attractive or unattractive. Tell me the truth. Seeking out all the information, analyzing things fully, looking for different perspectives. Anyway, and trying to minimize bias. So get rid of those structural faults that reinforce groupthink, and demand provocative opinions be heard with respect. And then you'd get better decisions, and you'd get better outcomes, and you'd avoid more catastrophes. And you'd avoid the dysfunctionality you see in Russian government. Okay, and they should have a critical evaluator telling them why his problems are going to go wrong. Different viewpoints should be examined dispassionately. They should have different working groups to look into the same issue, and so forth. All right, so I think that's enough from me. Okay, so please donate to me on what's it called? On Patreon, georgecallahan79 at gmail.com. Bye.